Hello, I'm Ruairí McKiernan and welcome to the Love and Courage podcast. This is a community-supported podcast made possible by donors and patrons like you. You can help the podcast grow by subscribing to it, leaving a review and a rating, and by spreading the word wherever you can. You can also support by becoming a donor or a patron and receive a Love and Courage t-shirt, badge, special mentions online, and discounts on future workshops and events. You can find out more at loveandcourage.org. Thanks so much for your support. It really means a lot and is hugely appreciated. I hope you enjoy the podcast.
Finally, over a few years, pretty well all my peers in the Jesuits left, one after another, and I was kind of left companionless and lonely and uncomfortable in my life. And a good insight I had at that was, I'm always talking about change. The world needs to change. Everybody needs to change. Well, I had to change.
My guest in this episode is Eamon Stack, a former Jesuit priest with a background in peace and justice work in Ireland and overseas. Eamon is the co-founder of Enclude, a non-profit that promotes technology for social good. Enclude is now 10 years old and has become the largest IT charity consultancy in Europe and has also started working in Venezuela. Eamon is all about the love, as I'm sure you'll hear now, in what was a fascinating conversation when I joined him at his kitchen table one afternoon in North Dublin. So, Eamon, thanks very much for agreeing to do this interview with me. It's a pleasure to see you again. How's life with you?
I'm great, Rory. You're very welcome to my house here in Monteenie on the north side of Dublin.
Overlooking Dublin Bay and Howth Head. It's a lovely part of the world to live. Have you lived in this part long?
So we've been here since I got married about 7.5 years ago, and it's glorious. It's at the end of a cul-de-sac, so it's really quiet, looking out on a park, and it's a good place for to be as a person, to live, and to be beside the sea, and then to be kind of very conscious of the move of the seasons, so it's better than it has been for quite a few years. So I'm very grateful for that.
I'm intrigued by this part of Dublin because there's such access to nature as well, with St Anne's Park, Dollymount, Bull Island, Howth Head, and yet the city is so close. But I'm also intrigued by the fact that not that many people seem to take advantage. Have you noticed that yourself?
Oh, yeah. So we've gone down to the beach in the morning. Like, it's 5 minutes down to Dollymount Beach, and to find it empty regularly, to have it to ourselves. So that's surprising. And it's only the odd really sunny day that brings out the populace. And then in Howth, what's interesting is, and it says a lot about Ireland, at the weekends, often when you're walking the cliff walk, there's just a whole lot of people from different countries with their whole families, So the Polish people are there with granny and granddad and so on. And so there's less English spoken than any language.
I noticed that myself on both sides of Howth Head, particularly a lot of Italians, and I wonder, it must be in some particular guidebook. So I don't know, it does raise the question for me sometimes, wonder, are Irish people more removed from the outdoors or more removed from nature? Because obviously it's cold and it's wet a lot of the time, but then the days it isn't, there aren't so many Irish people out. Do you think that's something that's happened in our culture at all, or
I'm not sure. I see for myself, and I suppose my family had tended to be outdoor people. So,
tell me about your family and where you grew up.
So and that's part of being by the sea here is because I was used to that as a child, being brought up in Tralee. So just looking up on the mountains and looking out to the sea from Tralee, it's a glorious place. Even when I was young and cycling my little bicycle to school, I didn't always notice, except for the odd exceptional day, there'd be snow and suddenly the landscape would be utterly transformed.
And you grew up in Tralee town or nearby?
Oh, very much towny, very much in the town, and myself and 4 sisters and my parents lived in the town, and it's a lovely place to be brought up. And my dad worked in the county council. He was a council worker. He was actually county secretary and county manager for a while. So that's
And your mother, she was a Kerry woman, or?
She was a Tipperary woman, and when my dad was moving around in the tour of various county councils,
he brought something back.
He found her in Templemore, County Tipperary, and brought her to Tralee. Yeah. And they had great friends in Tralee, and that was a marvellous. It was a great place to bring up kids, and a great place for them to live and have circular friends. And my mother still has those friends. In fact, at this stage in her life, she's watching them die, people I've known all my life. So it's a testimony to the place. There was genuine community.
Yeah, can you describe your household when you were a young man or a young boy, perhaps around the age of maybe 7 or 8, and what life was like for you there?
Yeah, we lived in a kind of a small street with about 25 houses, and everybody knew everybody, and some more open and some less. And then I had very good friends who I'm still friends with, particularly one guy called him Shukru, who's a dentist now. But we were brought up together, and we used to do things together. So and then my family, I'd say a character to my family is my dad was always very busy. So he was always out at meetings and so on. And that now looking back on it, I can see I have inherited some of that kind of being busy about projects and seeing them through, but then that's at a cost of being away. And then my mother was came from a business background, but she stayed at home to bring up the 5 of us, and she was very focused on that and that sense of the great mother, the great Irish mother for that time in her life. So that was our. And then I went to local school there. Now that it's 2016, I'm looking back at Tralee was quite a Republican place in that time. Or some of my teachers were kind of extremely Republican, but that kind of washed over me because my family weren't. My family were kind of very neutral about politics, and I think that was a good thing and a healthy thing. In that sense, I think my dad was quite a reflective person. I suppose he'd have the strongest intellect in the family, and both in terms of politics, he'd have kind of an independent view of it, and in terms of faith, he would have been just say at the edge of the church, even though it wasn't very public at the time. But that would have been his position, and I that has influenced me hugely. That sense of you have to think for yourself, and you have to value things as you see them, but also be critical and not just take everything as society takes it. So I appreciate that.
And when you were, say, a teenager around the age of 16, 17, how did the adolescent or the young man emerge? What was on your mind?
Yeah, what was a big change for me is I went to boarding school. So I left Tralee when I was 12, and I went to Rossgrey, to the Cistercian College in boarding school, an all-boys environment, having been brought up with 4 sisters. And I found that very hard. So that's just a personal change for myself. And for all 5 years, I did not find it easy in boarding school. And in those days, it wasn't as easy to come home. So your sentence was 8 weeks or longer before you get back home again. So that was challenging. And in that, I suppose I developed more my independence within that. So I something I probably had learned from my dad, and thinking it also became in my life there. I didn't fit in as easily with everybody, and therefore I had to stand on my own 2 feet. And one of these kind of lovely moments of insight at 16 or 17, when I was talking about travellers' rights and quite passionately about it, and a friend of mine turned to me and says, "You really believe that stuff, don't you?" And I just took it for granted that everybody believed in that stuff, but actually they didn't. So that was an interesting kind of moment for myself to say, oh, I do have strong opinions, and that will mark my life, because that's not everybody's way of dealing with the world.
Yeah, so obviously human rights and social justice has been a theme in your life, and it does sound to me that some of that did come from your family, or at least your ability to look outside and make up your own mind. So when you did look at the situation facing travellers or other issues in society, like what was big in Ireland at that time, and what was kind of calling for your attention?
Yeah, so I suppose I transitioned then from boarding school to college in Dublin. So I studied engineering in Trinity in the late 70s, early 80s, and I loved college and brand new buildings in Trinity at the time. The arts building was new, and yet I was drawn out to the city centre. And Ireland was struggling with chronic poverty and division at the time. And I was appalled to find that here am I, a young privileged student, only hundreds of metres from people who were chronically poor, and like poor you would have expected in the third world, but you were seeing it in Dublin. And so that did affect me, and just said, wow, our world is very imperfect. Our Ireland is very imperfect. And I did feel I prefer to know that than not know that. And at least that's a starting point in my kind of growing up. And then the next question emerges, well, what'll I do about it? And in the years in college, then that began to affect me more. I got involved in, and I was surprised at the Vincent de Paul Society in a kind of a more systematic way. And then I kind of took a more leadership role in that as the years went through in college. So that's growing up as an adult and kind of taking responsibility. And in some of the Vincent de Paul work, I was hopeless. Like out visiting people, I enjoyed doing it and I liked to do it, but I wasn't naturally good at the chit chat or so on. And that was a personal learning. But yet I was very interested in the social situation in Ireland. And at the time, then I asked myself, what will I do? And the one place I found some coherent answer to that question was in reflection around the faith and justice. So there was a kind of a live kind of movement that had emerged in the Catholic Church there, a minority part in the church, but was very passionate about social justice in society and how the Jesus of the gospel lived that out, and that somehow we lost that message. And I was really taken by that, and it's great as a young student being open to that message and saying, well, I want to go out there and heal the blind and get the prisoners out and change the world. And I was drawn by the message and felt, God, a coherent line here is the social Christian message. And therefore, I over the last 2 years in college, I changed direction and decided to go into religious life. I was at first drawn towards the diocesan church in Dublin, but I found the message more coherent in the Jesuits at the time, particularly Peter McVerry, who's still kind of a very inspiring figure. And so I was drawn towards the Jesuits, and I joined in 83.
And did you go to Maynooth, or where did you go from there?
So well, it's good to see where I went. One is, it was a very weird thing to do for my family. They found it very hard. And I went out near here to Manresa House in Dollymount, was the 2-year novitiate. And my dad and my mother brought me out. And I could see it caused them quite strain and stress that I was making this decision. And particularly my dad.
Because it wouldn't have been a strange thing at the Ireland of the time. There were still plenty of people, joining the church and joining the priesthood. Not as many
in the past. No, there had definitely been a downturn. Now, it was, not that long after the papal visit, John Paul, I love you visit. So there was a little bit of movement, but at the time I wasn't really reflecting on that. It wasn't a minority enough thing, Very few others out of college were joining religious life at that time. But there were a few, yeah. And I was then I encountered a good group of friends in the Jesuits, many of whom are still my friends 40 years later.
And so your parents presumably gave you the blessing, so to speak, in the end, and you went off, and it's a 7-year period in the seminary, is it? Or religious life, the Jesuit formation training is 10 years, but in the middle of it there was a 2-year full-time engagement. So I went to Limerick and worked in the Crescent College Comprehensive, and at the same time worked in Limerick Youth Services. So that was my first engagement with full-time work. And so what was it, 26 or 27 at that stage. Yeah. So, and then I found that really good. But really good to get out there and earn your money, even though I wasn't earning any money, but work within the school. Teaching is great as well, because you're confronted with these merciless students who will confront you with who you are, and yet your job is to engage with them.
And then you listen to people, education people, about what makes a good teacher. Because I liked teaching, and I kind of have, I think I have a good ability there that was developed in me. But the thing was, do you care? Do you care about your students? Do you, in some form, love your students is a key thing to having success as teaching. And the other is, are you good at teaching them, helping them to learn? And that's, it's kind of very basic stuff, and all the other stuff is secondary. And, I did find that. Yes, I cared about the people, and I cared in Crescent College Comprehensive. There were groups of pupils came from poor areas, and there was a task to make them more comfortable when the environment wasn't their natural place to be. And I felt I had a role to play in that. The other thing I was very interested as well is how to put the stuff that had influenced me in terms of experiencing other aspects of social life to the more privileged students in the Crescent. And so I developed a program whereby all the students went out for at least 1 week to some area, whether it was working with children with intellectual disabilities, or working in the Centre for Alcoholics, or working in Limerick Youth Service, or so on, that every student went out for 2 weeks and they were prepared and came back. And I was delighted to do that. And it was kind of a little bit of my own experience being shared with them. And that still goes on. Like 50 years later, or whatever it is, 40 years later, they're still running those programs. And I'm very proud of that. It was a small thing, but it was kind of making a little mark here. That, looking back on it, I think I'm glad I did. Yeah.
Absolutely. Like, if that's, I don't think it's 50 years now. You're looking at you're 40. A bit more sprightly than that. Yeah. But that's a great example of a legacy that somebody can leave, a practical legacy where presumably many thousands of students have been through that program now, and therefore tens of thousands of people affected.
Yes, yeah. And other schools have taken up the same program, so it's become more. Yeah, I think that, and it's so simple, and it's such a kind of a normal thing to do, where people just see the other side of the world, and then they share that, because different people have different experiences. One of our great adventures then in that program was to bring people from Limerick to Portadown. So to cross the border in the dark old days. And I regularly brought groups of students up to Portadown College, which would be an equivalent kind of upper middle class college in Portadown. And to find that there was a lot more in common than it was different in the middle class side of things. Whereas when the same Limerick students were encountered kind of a working class youth club, the division was much clearer. The divisions were more social than they were political or religious.
So this was not just a cross-border trip, but it was across the political divide, so to speak.
Yes, yeah. And very interesting then tours to Belfast and walking around Belfast in the dark old days of the 80s when bad things were happening and division was...
We're talking about the early 80s here?
Mid-80s. Mid-80s,
okay,
yeah.
So that just past the hunger striker period, and things would have been fairly tense.
Yes, and particularly it was just after the Anglo-Irish Agreement, where there was a lot of no voices in the unionist community. And Ulster says no, and here are us Taigs coming up from the south, and it was quite difficult for certain groups to meet us because the feelings were very strong.
So you were obviously very much interested in justice and faith, obviously, but bridge building, and it sounds like peace building, because there are still people that haven't necessarily crossed the border or are still afraid to in some ways. But you were bringing people together and bringing ideas together. And is peace in general something that you've thought about in the Irish context and Irish political context?
Yeah. Absolutely. When I was in Trinity, obviously, I was very aware that there were a lot of people from the north there, and there was a lot of Protestants, and I was a Kerry Catholic, so I was very involved in ecumenism during my time in college. And one of the mad things only a Catholic could do is I used to go to Church of Ireland Mass every week, and it was an odd thing to do, but I very much engaged in trying to view the world from the other side. And I think it naturally division goes against my natural instinct. I don't think there should be division. I think it's great for people to have different opinions and share them, but I don't think we should be divided as a result of it. And Christian division makes no sense to me whatsoever. So there was a definite kind of reaction to that, or attempt to move in the other direction. So even as a young man, I was involved in ecumenical work or living on the other side. I had two really good experiences then. That as a young Jesuit, I was sent up to Portadown one summer, and it was one of the it was 85, I think, and the parade was particularly difficult. The parading season was particularly difficult there, and I witnessed, riots and madness like I'd never met before, and violence and clear injustice to me. But a wise Jesuit then the following year says to me, well, you have to go on the other side. And so I spent the following summer living on the Shankill Road and had to change my name. So I was Eddie, and I worked in a Christian coffee shop where they showed me how to make orange cake, just to make the point. And I was there working with another guy from the south, was from Cork. And he was a Methodist, and he was working in youth clubs there. So I spent a few weeks viewing the world from the very opposite side.
So you Eddie the imposter, essentially?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Innocent me, yeah. And a very dangerous time. But in fact, I had to leave suddenly because there was a Catholic builder had been murdered in the Shankill, and I had to suddenly leave. And they were nervous, and like it there were awful times. But I think that's so important to see the world from the other side. I think, and nothing beats experiencing it. And like walking out of a coffee shop every morning and seeing a bit of graffiti on the wall across the way. Fuck the Pope. I said that's a perspective on the world, and yeah, that was real. That was real. Yeah.
How old were you around then?
Probably 26 or 27. Yeah.
And so then, tell me how life came about then for the next few years into your 30s.
But the most exciting kind of academic thing I did is I started studying theology. And that did fire me up, and that made sense of why I made the decision. Because I really liked engineering, and I was naturally attracted to that. But I found myself even more attracted to theology and just all aspects of it. Bringing in the philosophy that I had learned, which was also good as part of solid Catholic teaching of priests. You learn philosophy first, you learn the language, you learn the thoughts, but then you go into theology, and I just loved it. I just loved just reflecting on how God moves us and how the love of God might be active in the world, and to critically look at that. So I spent 2 years kind of doing the academic theology in Middletown in Dublin, and then I did have the insight to say, well, I wanted to finish my theology in the other side of the world. So I asked, and was very grateful to be allowed to go to finish my theology in Venezuela, in a school of theology there that was particularly influenced by the liberation movement. And I studied under a great Jesuit there, Pedro Gonzalez, and it hugely influenced me. And some of the subjects that I had studied in Europe, I studied again in Latin America, particularly Christology, a major topic, and just how two schools can approach the same topic in totally different ways is extraordinary.
Can you give me an example of that?
Well, say it could be one school focusing on Christ and the Pauline approach to Christology, and the struggling with the natures of Christ. Was he human? Was he person? And lots of big debates around that in the church. And that was very good to learn all that. The other starts with the historical Jesus. And he's born poor into the world, marginalised, and that was no accident, that the incarnation was God entering into our world, but choosing to enter at the poorest point. And that the historical story of Jesus' life, and then looking at his death from the perspective of a political and a religious assassination. It was just really exciting kind of theological reflection. And in that, the key insight is love. That in all that political and social worldly persecutions, this person absolutely loved and insisted that was the victory. love over death, love over anything you can throw at me. I think that's that personally, I suppose, finally helped me articulate my own belief that that's what it's all about. Our faith. We say it, but we don't live it. That it's all about, love one another as I have loved you. And one another is everyone. Love everyone as I have loved you. And then resist anything that goes against that is fundamental. So I was blown away, to say the very least.
We talk, well, you've mentioned a lot about the other side and seeing and hearing other experience and different perspectives. And there's a lot of division in the world at the moment, particularly in the area of religion, or at least perceived divisions. And I'm just curious as to the nature of Islam or Buddhism. Like, why for you, why Catholicism or why Christianity or why any religion for that matter, like, because you're someone who's described yourself as an independent thinker.
Yeah.
Have you explored other traditions, or have you explored having no tradition and yet still having that same belief or similar values?
So firstly, I'd say faith and spirituality are a fundamental part of our humanity, and the lack of that is a poverty. It's a dimension of our life that needs to be expressed through art, but also through religion. And if you take that away, and I would say you just lose something. So it doesn't matter whether you're a profound Hindu or a Confucianist or I'm trying to struggle with the words for Islam, so a Muslim. To me, that's irrelevant. What's important is that dimension of humanity is nourished, and that you're a complete person in that sense. You're kind of slightly lacking if you don't have that. So then what you have to accept is the limits. And I'm interested in looking at, from a global perspective, the incarnation of God into the planet. Well, God had to choose, and he couldn't choose every religion. He had to choose one religion, which turned out to be Judaism, and he had to choose a particular part of the world. And so we're limited. We're as human beings, and therefore I'm born into Ireland, and I'm born a Catholic, and I think that's great. That's where I am. I wasn't born a Muslim, and therefore I have no idea what it's like to be born one, and I can never be born that. However, I profoundly respect the fact that somebody else is. And I'm absolutely convinced any problems we have are got to do with excesses. They've got to do with extremes. So extreme Catholicism, extreme evangelical Protestantism, extreme Islam are all equally awful, because they take something really good and turn it on itself, or use it for human reduction purposes instead of human creating stuff. And I find that very, in every walk, that's bad.
There possibly people listening to this, or somebody listening to this who might have just heard you say, well, they may not have that faith or that belief or that religion, and it may feel that you've said that they need something to be this fuller person, and they maybe feel perfectly complete and perfectly whole, and you've possibly just said that they're lacking.
Yeah.
How do you do you just stand by your words on that one? Or?
Well, one is, we're all lacking. None of us are the complete full thing. However, there is a project for us to grow. There is a project for us to grow in our full humanity. Many people don't have that choice. People who are hungry don't have a huge choice to grow fully. And that's a lot of people in the world. And other people who live in very restricted political situations don't have the opportunity to develop or grow. People who live in oppressive religious situations don't have to. But when you do have the choice, then it's great. It's a great thing to allow yourself grow in every dimension of your life. And I think the most important one is your capacity to love. So whatever does that. So sometimes people don't name the spiritual thing, but they actually have it anyway. So they're like it's about whether your heart has stretched and that you really grow in this capacity to love. And many ways can do that, but there's no doubt about it that the consistent message of faith can help you in that respect. The tools that are used within faith, meditation and spirituality, help you reflect on your life and so on. But possibly they're not the only one. And then there are different obviously approaches to faith from different religions that would be probably equally useful. But the purpose is to grow as a full human being. And there's an important thing that growing in that human being is growing in community as well. So the Western society, has had this fantastic renaissance with the Enlightenment of valuing the person, valuing the individual person and the dignity of the person. But if maybe we've moved to a little extreme on that one and we've lost that sense of, that there's a balance between the person and community. And community is everybody. It stretches out to every corner of the world. So I do believe there's a real struggle here for us to both value where we have arrived with psychology and with great reflection and philosophy in the last, say, 400 years, but also to say there's a real challenge for us to understand the world as one community. And it's not okay that 70% are poor, and it's not okay that some of them are chronically poor. So we should never settle on that. So as much as it's it's important to have that faith side of ourselves, it's absolutely vital we have a community side to ourselves as persons. And that even though I can't fix all the problems of the world, I do want to be angry about the problems of the world, that the children that die every day. As I had a good moment in the Make Poverty History campaign in '95. I was involved in, of saying that we do want to end poverty. That's what my heart wants, and I'm not going to let that go. I mightn't fix it and mightn't happen in my lifetime, but I'm not letting go that ideal that's the way and that is not okay. That 30 children die every hour or whatever was the slogan at the time. That is never ever okay, and I think it's good we carry that with us every day.
Tell me more about your experience of the Make Poverty History campaign.
Yeah, that was. I think there are good moments in history and cycles in history where things happen and something moves in people's hearts and so on. So around the 2000s, a little bit happened, but it didn't really happen in terms of the millennium and, will we make a new start in the world and so on. But by 2005, there seemed to have been a genuine move to explore what are the things we need to do, the concrete things we need to do. And at that time, it was about debt forgiveness of nations was so important. It was about fair trade, and it was about development resources, so the 0.7% to share that from the wealthy countries with the poorer countries. So there was a very big movement in England, the Make Poverty History campaign in the UK, but one of the leaders of it was Bono from Ireland. So I got involved in about a year before the campaign in Ireland, and I kind of said, look at it, a lot of these people in the UK have done a good thing. Could we ride that wave and do something in Ireland? And I was with a very small organisation at the time, the Debt and Development Coalition. It's very small, and our normal events had a couple of hundred people at them on a good day. So the Make Poverty History was happening in 2005. So we organised a rally for a week before the big UK rally, which actually was happening in Edinburgh. And it was Thursday afternoon, and we kind of invited everybody who wanted to join this moment in history of saying, we want to change. And what was extraordinary is 20,000 people turned up at a rally outside the Dáil. It was the biggest gathering that non-profits had organised in the history of the state. It's just extraordinary. People who had no vested interest in this whatsoever. We have people at the minute who are very taxed about, say, water charges in Ireland and so on, but that's, there's a real vested interest. This was people gathering together because they wanted the world to be a bit better. And I said that was, for me, that was just a moment of great encouragement to say, well, people are willing to come out sometimes and say, we want change, and we'll do that together. So, yeah, that's in a nutshell, that's the Make Poverty History moment. Sadly, it was followed by an economic crash a couple of years later, and a lot of the gains were lost.
So, Eamon, I want to take you back to where you were in Venezuela. You're presumably come back to Ireland around that time, and what happens next?
Yeah, so it was personally a big moment there. I was ordained a priest in the parish in Ballymun in it was 93, so at the end of 93, and that was a nice moment for my family and so on, because I had a lot of training, a lot of years where I was in out of circulation. So suddenly I was into full-time work as a priest, and my first appointment was to Portadown. So I was absolutely delighted to go back to Portadown, where I had been as a student, and it was a time when the peace process was warming up, and there was hope, and I was glad to be there, for that moment to see how that would emerge. So I started there in 93. So I was involved in community development in the Drumcree Community Centre. So that had been established by the Jesuits in the community over the previous 10 years. And so at first I was just doing regular community development work in an area of very serious poverty and many social problems, as well as the context of the chronic political social division that was solidified during the sad times of the Troubles. And so I remember in 1995 then we had the first street protest. So so an issue for the people in the place I was living with was that they had orange parades through the heart of their community once a year that drove them mad, that they found very hard to manage, and was the occasion then for all the hotheads of the community to go out and riot and fight with the police and so on. And from a community development point of view, that was a disaster. That not alone did it set community back every single year cyclically, and of course it set all possibilities of bridging the divide, of ecumenism, of community unification just back, and it was cyclical every single year. So we kind of had built on protests that had been going on for the previous 10 years, and a good discipline of non-violent protests that had been developed. So there was tea parties held on the road before the parades and were clearly non-violent, and that tradition was quite successful. So that was in 95. So those who know a bit of history know things are going to go seriously south in the next couple of years. So in 95 then we decided to be a little more assertive in our protests. So 94 had been the peace agreement, and so there was no longer bombs, there were no longer killings in the north, and for the first time, the Catholic community could unite around a major issue. With violence there was division, but in the absence of violence, the community came together. So you had the more moderate SDLP types and then the more radical Sinn Féin types coming together and saying, well, let's work together to try and do something about these parades that are damaging our community in a cyclical fashion. And so at that stage, there was clearly two different presentations of the issues. There was the SDLP type, faith types were talking about dignity and justice for all, and the others were, the more radicals were no sectarian parade slogans. And so there was two kind of different philosophies going, but everyone trying to do the same thing. So we sat on the road, on the Garvaghey Road on Drumcree Sunday 2005, and the police refused to allow the parade to go down the road at that moment. They wouldn't move us, and we were almost caught by surprise at that decision at that moment. And it's just that the Orange Men and the Unionists went berserk, and there was very serious standoff in Drumcree. There was massive rallies of up to 20,000 people on the hill about 2 miles away from where we were, like very difficult to contain for the police. And that went on for a few days and got more and more serious. And eventually mediators were brought in, and we figured that there was serious danger of loss of life, and we decided to step off the road on that year. So that was a very difficult decision for the Catholic community, but there was unity in that, and we just got off the road and stood with our backs as the Orange Men silently walked down the road early one morning. And
what was your role exactly in all of this? Like you're a priest, you're a community worker, you're essentially becoming, I'm presuming, a community leader. Were you?
I was one of the founders of the United Coalition, which is the Garvaghey Road Residents Coalition. So I was one of the 3 leaders. And I was there to say, really, it had nothing to do with religion. I was a priest whose voice was, this is not about religion, and don't mind if they tell you it's about religion. That, this is about community, and this is about limits to people's rights. That everybody can't do everything all the time. We all have to live limits. And that about fairness, that the limits we live under are shared by everybody. And that one group doesn't have certain limits and others have other different limits. That we all share the same limits as communities. And that essentially this parade thing was unfair. So my role was there. As well, it was to voice, the 50 or 60% of the community who were moderates, who never supported the violence. So it was to be the moderate voice in all the conversations and say, let's see, can we do this reasonably? But that decision to step off the road was a disaster. It was great for us, but it had consequences that we weren't going to do that 2 years in a row. So I started to have serious emotional fear from that moment on, because I said, this is going to come back in a year's time and we're not going to step off the road. Like that's not a reasonable request. And after the parade in Drumcree Sunday 2005, when the Orangemen arrived at the bottom of the road, there's a famous image of them being joined by Ian Paisley and David Trimble, and them holding their hands in the air, marching through the centre of Portadown. Like, what a bad choice they made on that day. And they were always going to live with that choice. And I said, so we did everything in our power over the next 12 months to try and resolve this issue. And the most interesting thing we did as a community is, and I remember it was important for myself to say, are we right? Have we got it right? It seems right to us, our position, but is it right? So we went to a few political philosophers, both in Ireland and abroad, and say, look, this is our argument. This is our position against the Orangemen. Have we any justification for our position? And that was a really good thing to do. That was partly my role to say, we can talk to these people. They have views. And we did realise that some of the arguments we were using were nonsensical, like no sectarian parades was not a very good position to take. However, a very good position to take was equal citizenship. Within the peace process, we're asking for equal citizenship, and that it's equal citizenship with respect to expressing your cultural identity in public. And we were given good language, and they were saying, well, if you put your arguments together, you're very coherent, as long as you don't use nonsense arguments. And then those arguments are inclusive, because the other side can also talk in that language. It's an inclusive. So that was a real education process for me, in seeing how good language and philosophy can help grassroots communities to express themselves in a way that creates possibilities. So, but we were moving to 1996, and the peace process broke down. So we're heading into the summer of 2006. We weren't going to step off the road if there was an orange parade, and the peace process had broken down. And that was a moment of terror. Would we start the war? Would our actions inflame the situation and restart a conflict that was slipping? The peace was slipping.
So your relatively small community group had the eyes of the world on it in some ways. I actually remember watching on TV.
Absolutely. So once it came,
and you're
a
relatively young man.
I'm absolutely a young Kerry man on the Garvaghey Road at 33 years of age. Maybe 35 at that stage, so relatively inexperienced person in the public eye.
And it was global headline.
Yeah. So once it approached, you'd have all the television stations from Britain and Ireland and Reuters and many others, watching us and listening to us at every moment. And under that pressure, it was really challenging to. Sometimes I managed to articulate well, and sometimes I failed. And I found that very frustrating, that you wanted to communicate well your message, but sometimes you failed. Because when you failed, you just allowed the others more room to maneuver.
And how did it all play out in the end over the next couple of years?
So in 1996, then we sat on the road and we refused to move. and there were 3 days of negotiations, high-level negotiations in Ulster carpets, I remember at the time, and the archbishops were party to it and peace mediators. And eventually we were told to go home one day, and we knew it was over, and we were taken off the road that day. In 1996, we were just dragged off the road, and there were some spectacular pictures of me being lumped off the road, and another one of myself with a woman with her face bleeding that actually became the image that was very widely circulated. Even some of my friends from Latin America were saying, "Oh, I just seen you on it." So it was quite a relatively big situation that was global, and the peace held. And that was extraordinary. It didn't inflame the peace, and that was kind of giving me a little bit of confidence here. That, but the fear. So in 2000 or 1997, the following year, there was an agreement behind the scenes that the parade would proceed for the last time, and that was the last time the parade ever took place. There is an extraordinary moment from 2007 where we couldn't go to mass ourselves. So you had this extraordinary ironic situation that in order to facilitate the Orangemen to go to a church service at the end of our estate and walk through the middle of it, they banned us from going to mass. So we held mass on front of the British personnel carriers, and it was a very a good moment of protest, of simple protest, and all the residents were sitting there on their own chairs that they carried in to say mass in front of it. And we came to the sign of peace in the mass. And so there was 5 priests, I was one of them, and behind us there were about 20 soldiers. And there was a choice. And I chose to go back and shake hands with the soldiers. And I've never been forgiven for that by that community or by a lot of members of that community. And yet, that was the action, one of the actions in my life I'm proudest to have done. And I am absolutely convinced, and the historians might say that was a disaster for the Orangemen and for the British government. That's not what they wanted. A peaceful gesture towards the British soldiers in a very potentially conflictual situation, stating that this there was a very clear division between the hate, the violence, the murders, and a movement that was looking for equal citizenship that would build peace in the long term. And that's, I think, has happened.
So were you ostracized, or what happened? How did that play out in the day-to-day? People found it hard to be warm to me after that. There was a hurt in the nationalist community as a result of that, and that over time, it took people quite a few years to let that go. And so, what was the impact on you personally? I was saddened. These were my friends, and I wasn't absolutely sure. There were doubts in my mind that maybe I shouldn't have done it or whatever. But the stronger voice in me was no, that was the right thing to do. And I think it came from a powerful personal moment during the whole Drumcree thing, where I felt bitterness was about to get into my heart. I mean, a few people had been killed, and people I knew had been killed, and a few policemen had been killed during the conflict. And I could feel in my own heart the bitterness was getting in there. There was room for negativity and for something that would be expressed as anger, but which was actually a more dark spirit. And I think I was glad that I had been given the tools as a Jesuit to be aware of that and to give myself space and guidance to resist that and to say, whatever happens here, I'm not going down that route. I think that's an important personal decision for everybody, no matter what you're into, even personal conflicts with people. If you spot that kind of bitterness getting into your own heart, get out of there. Get help and get out of there, because that's the stuff that destroys you. It's internally. It's not it's less your external actions. It's more your internal, personal, spiritual movement that is the thing that counts.
And I think I remember speaking about that at the time. People being surprised. It says, from that perspective, it doesn't matter whether the Orange Men go up or down the road. Like, it doesn't matter what is the outcome of the thing. What matters is what's in our hearts, whether we end up loving at the end of this or not. And if we don't, there's no victory that will compensate for that, and there's no loss that's worth it. So so that probably left me leaving that situation. Personally scarred, psychologically scarred. It was very, very intense, but stronger as a person and clearer about what was important in my own heart.
And where to after Drumcree? Where did you make a decision to move on, or were you called elsewhere?
I was due to move. There's another part of Jesuit training that you do after 5 years of work on the ground. It's a very wise thing to do, and so I was due to go to Mexico. I chose to go and asked and was given permission to go to Mexico for that, and it was a good time to get away from it. And it's great. The Mexicans had no idea what it was all about. A whole new perspective from something that for the previous number of years was everything and was big news and so on. Well, meant nothing to the Mexicans. They had a lot more problems. They were a lot bigger than any Drumcree situation. That gives us perspective on life. God, yeah. So that was that. Mexico was good, and I love Mexico. Mexico is just a fantastic country and just a diverse mix of cultures. No one thing, and I suppose it was a good place to enjoy that.
And take me from there to where you are here today. Like you're running a non-profit technology, social innovation, social change organisation. And how did you end up from Drumcree to Mexico to social entrepreneur, innovator?
Yeah. I suppose one of the involved a big transition in my own life. That when I came back and was working in Ireland for a few years, I was working in an organisation called Shliela, which was a faith and justice project for young adults in Ireland. I had an experience of the church collapsing for me at that point. That I probably had been in the Jesuits over 20 years, and virtually nobody else had joined in those 20 years. Clearly, the papacy of John Paul II had moved the church to the right, and the scandals in the church, the child sexual abuse scandals, which were awful in themselves, but they also had an effect of pushing the church even further to the right. And I was just uncomfortable. That's not the faith and justice project that I had joined. And finally, over a few years, pretty well all my peers in the Jesuits left, one after another, and I was kind of left companionless and lonely and uncomfortable in my life. And a good insight I had at that was, I'm always talking about change. The world needs to change. Everybody needs to change. Well, I had to change, and that was going to be hugely difficult for me. So I moved on then from the Jesuits, and on good terms, but I know the Jesuits found it very, very painful. Somebody who had been 21 years and very committed and very involved, choosing to move on. And I moved on for those reasons. And so I was lost. A guy in his 40s, I had no project. And the Jesuits had both been my work and my community, and now I had no work and I had no community, and I had to start from scratch, and that's a good thing for us. It took me a few years to get my feet under me, and so one of the things that happened then shortly after that was I got involved in the Debt and Development Coalition, and then the project with Make Poverty History came about, and so I was able to contribute something to that project, and that might help to kind of restore my confidence. But in all that, I still had trained as an engineer a long time ago, and I had been conscious of all the charities that I'd worked in, all over the place, had issues managing information and using technology. Like, technology was very little part of what I did, except on the Garvaghy Road we used fax modems very, very effectively. So that's for campaigning, and that did have a huge impact. But other than that, and then the Make Poverty History showed how you use technology well. and how the ability to bring 20,000 people together, how to communicate with them and get across your message. And therefore, I went back to Trinity, to the Centre for Nonprofit Management, to look at the issue of information and charities and technology and charities. I was kind of shocked that there was no strategy. There was nowhere to put a strategy, and that it was very much piecemeal, and there was no funding to support charities doing it. And I had an interesting meeting with Paddy McGuinness. At the time he was Deputy CEO of Concern, and he'd been very involved in developing Concern. And I said to Paddy one day, I said, there's this real problem for Ireland Inc., that the charities are on the wrong side of the digital divide, and it contradicts our whole image. And he said to me, well, you better do something about it. And it was that spurred me on to say, well, I have to take an initiative here. And so I had met another guy who was coming from SAP, from the commercial world, but who had worked in Africa, like Kieran Hayden. And together we set up Enclude with the project to try and lead a strategy for technology use by charities that would help us deliver better service to more people within the limited resources. And
that was 10 years ago.
That was 10 years ago. We started off, just the two of us.
So tell me where Enclude is today and what Enclude does.
So from there, then 10 years on, I think we've learned a lot about the working with charities. One is that the donors are very generous. So it's a good thing to take full advantage of those who are willing to give technology to charities and take full advantage of that. But the second thing is we need to develop the capacity to use it. And so Enclude's biggest project is about helping charities to implement solutions that help them do their work better. And so we've kind of formulated that much better now. It's about alignment of the great donated technology with best practice. And we as charities understand what best practice is. If you want to know how to do homeless service, then you ask DePaul Ireland, the people in the services, and they'll tell you how to do it. And so the technology project is to align the good practice with the technology. Or in addiction services, again, people delivering those services in every corner of Ireland know how to do their business. And what's missing is the ability to say, well, how can you align the technology with that to help their referrals, help their assessment of clients, help their care planning, and lead to watching outcomes. And the technology then can contribute to a cycle of learning, where they're getting good structured information about what they do. They can reflect on that and say, we can do it even better. So the project is about contributing to that process. So it's very much integrating information and process stuff with the best practice to deliver effective solutions for people.
And presumably that saves a lot of money, not just for charities, but for foundations and for the state. So it's a sort of a win-win model, really, ultimately, isn't it?
It's absolutely. Like the donations are incredibly huge. Okay, so at the minute, we're managing to channel about €7 million worth of technology donations to Irish charities every year. And we're a small country, and yet there's so much more we could use.
And this is just in Ireland? Or?
Just in Ireland. And then then we have developed the capacity to use that. And so one of the difficulties was it's expensive. Consultancy projects are consultants, commercial consultants are very expensive for charities, and commercial consultants don't understand the business processes. So what we needed to create ourselves was a capacity. So we've built up a team of 21 people, many consultants who've come from the commercial world who are willing to take a 50% or 60% cut in their salaries to change their work, to work with charities, so that they can give them affordable services to help this I-Alliance process. I'm utterly inspired by these people. And I sometimes just name it as blessing. Like I've done nothing in that sense. I've done very little, except maybe create a room for those people to walk into and create connections whereby they can meet their extraordinary expertise and compassion with the needs of others who are out there in the coalface delivering services to domestic violence or homelessness or addiction. And it's great joy in my life to see that happen. And it's not me. it's just, I maybe helped to open the door to allow it to happen. Maybe something of that inspiration of my own dad, kind of to be able to see the bigger picture. And when you see it, it's kind of self-evident. You know, it's not magic, it's not extraordinary, it's self-evident. It's just not everybody finds themselves in a position where they see it self-evident. And so maybe good leadership then is to say, okay, I just happen to have this useful insight, and I'll lead other people in that direction. And man, they're fantastic.
Eamon Stack, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I wish you well with no doubt what is going to be many more years of adventure and discovery. Maybe we'll return again another 20 years to see how you're getting on.
I really enjoyed talking to you, Ruairí. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure, thank you. Thank you for listening to the Love and Courage podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I'd really love if you could subscribe to the podcast, rate it and review it, and spread the word on social media and wherever you can. While I love doing these interviews, they take a lot of time and effort in research, production, post-production and publicity, and there are some costs involved. If you would like to chip in and help the podcast grow, it would be really appreciated. All contributions welcome, and monthly patrons can receive a Love and Courage t-shirt, badge, special mentions online and discounts on future workshops and events. And this support helps me to help others in the community in my day-to-day work. My sincere thanks to all of you who have already supported in so many different ways. Also, just to say, I sometimes take on social change media, communications campaigns and strategic projects, and do talks and presentations, workshops in schools and colleges, community centres and at conferences. Topics range from mental health and personal development to youth and community empowerment, leadership, activism and social innovation. If you're interested in learning more about any of this, please let me know. So to get in touch, to offer feedback or suggestions, or to make a financial contribution right now, log on to loveandcourage.org or send me an email to podcast@loveandcourage.org. Thank you so much for all your support. Until next time, here's to you, to all of us, and to having the courage to create big change in our lives and in the world around us.